Good afternoon. Good to see all of you. My name is Will Bowden. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center and a professor here at the LBJ School. It's an honor to have such a big crowd today with that. And welcome to the first in what will be a slew of lectures that the Clements Center and our friends at Strauss Center are hosting throughout the semester. So please do keep your eye out for future announcements. Next Monday, we'll be hosting David Milne from the University of East Anglia talking about his fantastic new book, World Making. And next Tuesday, we'll be hosting David Firestein, a UT and LBJ alum with the East-West Institute, talking about the question of national exceptionalism as a potential driver of international conflict. But today, for our debut speaker for the 2016-2017 academic year, we're honored to be hosting Dr. Michael Ledeen. Michael and I first met 15 years ago when I was just a wee young grad student with a full head of hair, and not yet wise to the ways of the world. I was a junior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he held the Freedom Chair for many years, and he's now the Freedom Scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. A real polymath, Michael has expertise in a whole range of fields, from political philosophy, especially Machiavellianism, history of fascism, which we'll be hearing from today, also to a number of current contemporary issues, including authoring a very recent best-selling book, The Field of Fight, about the war on terrorism. He's quite creative in his writing, and is even, for any of you old spooks in the room, has been known to channel the spirit of James Jesus Angleton, the legendary CIA counterintelligence chief. So that might come out in the Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ledeen.
I'm not familiar with current university protocol. I read all these horror stories in newspapers and so forth. I'm very informal. I taught for some years at the University of Rome in Italy, where a certain percentage of my students were members of the Red Brigades. Two of my colleagues were shot dead on campus, walking around. So please feel free to be critical, to interrupt, to ask questions, to scream in anger, or to applaud in pleasure. And so I'm going to talk about fascism today, because everybody talks about fascism and nobody knows what it is. So I thought it would be useful to, at least for starters, run through what fascism was, what it wasn't, what it isn't. And my basic belief is that fascism is dead and over with. There are no fascists around today. As far as there are any, they tend to be in the radical Islamic sector of the world, and we don't have any here, and we haven't had any here. There's never been an American fascism, and a good place to start is with this fact about America. America has never had a viable fascist movement. America's never had a viable socialist movement, for that matter. And the main reason for that is that these are movements, as mass movements, that had an awful lot to do with nationalism. And there is no American nationalism. We don't have it. Nationalism is built around a concept of a kind of unified, more or less coherent society, whether that's because of race or religion or common history and so forth. And the United States does not have that. We are an amalgam of people organized around certain ideas. Tocqueville, way back in the 1830s, wrote and said, "Isn't it amazing that people can come to the United States from anywhere, with any background, with any set of belief, and in a matter of months become Americans?" Right? So we have patriotism. There are American patriots. There are no American nationalists, because there is no American nation. Fascism had everything to do with nation. And the fascists were hyper-nationalists. And the first important thing to know about fascism is that it is a war phenomenon. It was born in the trenches of the First World War, and the notion of fascism and what a fascist state should be, would be, and so forth, came from there. And it's very easy to understand. Fascism, World War I destroyed a Europe that people thought they knew. And after World War I, there was a total confusion as to what the world would become, what it would look like, what it would be, and who the powerful people would and should be, and what form of government the new nation states should take. So the number one doctrine that came out of that is that the war had defined the difference between leaders and followers. Basically, the people who performed well in the war were held to be superior people, and they should rule, they should govern, they should lead that society. And Mussolini, who was the leader of fascism, which was Italian fascism, Mussolini broke with the Socialist Party, of which he had been a very important leader, the editor of its newspaper, and so forth, on the issue of intervention in the war. For the first part of World War I, Italy was neutral, stayed out, said it didn't want to play a role. People like Mussolini insisted that Italy had to play a role in the war, had to fight for the then new Italian state. The Italian state comes into being first in 1860, everything except the Vatican. And then 1870-71, when the Vatican, the Holy See, is added to Italy, and Rome becomes both a part of the new Italian state and its capital, right? And after a while, Italy entered the war. One of the features of Italian history is very funny, and an awful lot of fun. And the basic rules about Italian history are exceedingly entertaining. And one of them is, it does not matter which side Italy is on when it enters the war. It is always on the winning side when the war is over. Right? And that's true of both world wars, and it's a keystone of Italian diplomacy. Very flexible, always willing to change doctrine, sides, approaches to things, strategic and tactical. And so Italy ended up at the end of the First World War on, of course, the winning side. And came to believe that even though they had lost almost every major battle against the Austrians, who were their major enemy, they had won the war, because when the peace treaty, when the peace conference at Versailles was organized, the Italians sat with the French, the British, the Americans, and so on, the people who had won not only diplomatically but also militarily. So, so this notion that people who had done well in the war, performed well in the war, were entitled to govern Italy, emerged in the new fascist movement. And the fascist movement, too, is contradictory in itself, because the symbol, where the name comes from, fascism, comes from the old Roman notion of the fasces, the bundle of wheat tied together. And you'll see that symbol if you bother to take a look at Italian fascism. I should tell you that my interest in and knowledge about Italian fascism, I spent a good 15 years in the archives of the fascist state in Rome, a long time. And I was lucky because I started to do that work in the early to mid-1960s, when the archives for the first time had been opened to scholarly study. I was destined, obviously, to do Germany, because if you did fascism, you did Germany. Germany was the big thing. Italy was a lesser thing, a smaller thing. And I was the research assistant to a very famous German historian George Mossing at the University of Wisconsin. And he was at the time writing books about Nazis. So I did Nazis for several years on various now famous books that George wrote, Nazi culture and things of that nature. And one night in the middle of the winter in Madison, Wisconsin, which is really something, I went to him and I said, George, I've had it up to here with Nazis. I can't stand it anymore. And I don't want to go to Germany. I was all set up to go to Germany and do my dissertation on Nazi schools, which nobody had done at that time. And that stuff was just first becoming available. And he said very brightly, why don't you go to Italy and do fascists? And I said, well, I don't speak Italian, and I don't know the first thing about Italian history. And he said, you speak French? And I said, yes. And he said, typical German intellectual. Well, then you speak Italian. So go, well, that was totally wrong. That's another one of these problems between Germany and Italy that I'll talk about shortly. I was very lucky. I got a very good grant, which I was convinced at the time was a CIA training program. I went to Italy. I was sent to Florence. I spent 3 months studying Italian. And then this foundation, which was Social Science Research Council and American Council of Learned Societies, insisted that 1 week out of every month I get out of wherever I was. So at first I was in Florence, Tuscany, get out of Tuscany and go to some other region and spend a week there. Then after several months of that, get out of Italy, go to some other European country and spend time there. So over the course of the 18 months of this wonderful fellowship, I don't know if it still exists, I think not, I did Europe. I became a Europeanist. The goal of the program was to create Europeanists. And the whole thing was just fascinating. And when I discovered that for Hitler, that Hitler's hero was Mussolini, and Hitler's model was Italy. After all, I mean, it seems intuitively obvious. The March on Rome that brought Mussolini to power in Italy is 1922. Hitler's consolidation of power in Germany is the mid-1930s. So you've got 10 to 15 years, during which time fascism develops in Italy, and various people around Europe are running around copying it. So I ended up doing my dissertation on Mussolini's attempts in the first 10 to 15 years to create a fascist international and to help fledgling fascist movements in other countries in Europe to develop and eventually to ally themselves with Italy and to provide a new model, not just for Europe, but for the rest of the world. And there's a lot of stuff in there about third world countries and their identities and their creativity. And one of the basic doctrines of fascism, as opposed to the Nazism, which did not believe this, is that creativity is linked to nation, again, with whatever the defining terms of nation are, whether it's race or religion or history or tribe or whatever it may be. And that their national creativity is to be unleashed by fascism, which will go to the roots of their creativity and so on. It's a fascinating phenomenon. It lost out. It disappeared. Because when Hitler became dominant in Europe, the Nazis would have none of this. I mean, the Nazi doctrine was the opposite of fascist doctrine in many important ways. And one of them was that the Aryan race, which defined not only Nazi Germany, but race defined every society fundamentally, was superior to all the others. And so Hitler and his people were interested in imposing their view of the world on others. Mussolini, at least at the beginning and for the first decade, believed that it was possible to take every one of modern societies, including places whose names are only now coming back into the newspapers, Montenegro, for example, was very important to the fascists in the 1920s because they thought that Montenegro had a uniquely creative population and that properly nurtured and supported, they could play a major role in the unfolding of the modern society. So anyway, fascist Italy goes through a very complicated evolution because when they come in with a doctrine of these are the good people, these are the people who should be ruling us, but to do what? If you look at the members of the fascist party early on in Italy, you will find a mixture of almost every doctrine, almost every ideology. Mussolini, after all, came from radical socialism. You had radical syndicalists. My second book was about a fantastic story. One of the great things about Italian history is that there are so many fantastic stories. I mean, so many incredible, melodramatic, colorful things happening. Italy had entered the war and made a series of agreements with us, the Brits, the French, and so forth, that they would gain territory along the Adriatic coast in what then became Yugoslavia, which today is Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and so forth, and that would become part of Italy. Along comes Woodrow Wilson and says no secret treaty, secretly arrived at, all this is off, and we're going to decide here at Versailles who gets what and so forth. And the Italians hated that because they'd been betrayed. And so there was at the time an Italian poet, dreadful romantic poet named D'Annunzio, who had been the hero warrior of the war on the Italian side. He was a pilot. He flew. There's no pressurized cabins. He flew over the Alps and targeted Austrian troops with leaflets, bombed them with paper, with poems, with rhetoric, and so forth. And when the Americans came along and said, you're not going to get this land, we're going to decide where it goes and how it goes and so forth, D'Annunzio went to Venice, organized an army of 10,000 men, marched down the coast, and occupied the city of Fiume, F-I-U-M-E, means river. It then became Rijeka. Today it is Rijeka. And he occupied that city for a year and a half. And if you do the history, as I did, of the city of Fiume for a year and a half, you find the whole 20th century. It's all there. And it was a fantastic thing. D'Annunzio is the person who perfected the technique of crowd control and relationship between leader and masses, the balcony address. He would stand on the balcony of the palace in Fiume and talk to the crowd. And the crowd would respond to him. And this forged a kind of relationship which at the time was totally new. There was no such thing. And if you listen to Mussolini's speeches later on, you will find that Mussolini's speeches are very different from Hitler's speeches. And you can learn an awful lot about, there are books now about crowds and masses, very important books. Sociologists have done a lot of great work on this. But a Mussolini crowd, for example, like a D'Annunzio crowd, is a give and take. And a lot of the initiative will come from the crowd. You listen to Mussolini, it's one of his most famous speeches, the Proclamation of the Empire. He starts talking, this is 1936, he starts talking, and people in the crowd start yelling at him, saying, talk about this, talk about that. In that same year, 1936, if you listen to Roosevelt's electoral speech in Madison Square Garden, at the time his electoral speeches were organized around three odious Republicans, Martin, Barton, and Fish. And Roosevelt would, in the course of his speeches, would always come to a break point and would say, and among these enemies of the New Deal and Saving America and so on were three odious Republicans, Martin, Martin, and Fish. And the crowd would chant Martin, Barton, and Fish. And in 36 in Madison Square Garden, he went on at some length about Joe Martin, who was a Republican congressman from Massachusetts, and started talking about all the bad things that Martin had done. He voted against this, he voted against that, and so on. And a voice in the crowd says, "What about Fish?" And everybody laughs. And Roosevelt laughs, and he says, wait a minute, I'll get to it, and so on. In other words, there's a kind of rapport between leader and masses that you will never find a thing like this in Hitler's speech. Hitler's speeches are all choreographed, all programmed. The crowd always knows there are going to be certain cues, and when these cues come, they're going to give three signals. Watch the Leni Riefenstahl movie, The Triumph of the Will, which gives you all of this. And look at that crowd. That crowd is a typical German crowd, and it was institutionalized during the Hitler period. But it's totally different from a Mussolini crowd because there's none of the spontaneous relationship. There is no notion that anyone in that crowd can suggest anything to the leader that the leader should have done, even in speech, even in language. So Italian fascism is turmoil, and there's always new things being announced, being invented, being created, and that's part of the doctrine. The doctrine is that fascism is a new form of government led by a new kind of person. That person is defined by his military qualities, by his heroism in battle, by his courage in the face of the enemy, by his willingness to die for his nation, and who is at the same time highly creative. I mean, what is Italian history? For fascist Italian history is the history of musicians, composers, poets, authors, warriors, and great government. I mean, Rome, for example. When in the 30s the fascists, Mussolini proclaims the empire after the conquest of Ethiopia, it's the fulfillment of the destiny of the Italian people. And Ethiopia is taken as a test case of what the new creative Italian people can do when they move into a new area and try to teach the people what Italian creativity is all about and so on. As that evolves, and as the Italian state starts to become unified for the first time, if you do Italian history, you will do the history of failed unification. Italy was never successfully unified, isn't successfully unified today. When I first got there, when I went there in the mid-60s, started to study Italian in Tuscany. The Tuscans all said, the only real Italian is spoken here. If you go elsewhere, it's you run into different dialects. And there were very different dialects all over the country. And indeed, in some areas, different languages. And to this day, if you go to Sicily, you will find a different language. Sicilian is not Italian, it's something else altogether. Some of the other dialects verge on being different languages. I wrote a book about Naples. Neapolitan verges on being a different language. And there are Neapolitan Italian dictionaries and verb wheels and so forth, where you hear something in Neapolitan and you have no idea what they're talking about. You could look it up and find it in Italian. This, of course, does not exist in Germany. In Germany, people speak German, and they know what German is. even though the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy take place at virtually the same time. And even though on paper, and as a matter of theory, it would seem as if Italy, as between the two countries, would be more likely to have a common language. After all, Italian was invented by Dante. And if you go to Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall in Florence, this beautiful building with that wonderful tower, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, on the walls inside you find quotations of Dante. And when I first got there, boy, I was damned if I could figure out what it meant. What did it say? Because it was in Tuscan. And the language into which Tuscan had evolved, the Italian language, is something entirely different. So you have a society badly divided internally to the point where they have even no common language, and they didn't start to have really a common language till radio. And common language didn't really take until television. And so we're talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, post-World War II, where the Italy that you see today begins to exist, and it's still divided in many ways. So Mussolini's first order of business was to unify the country and give them some sense of common identity. The fascists, that bundle of wheat all tied together as a symbol of unity. And yet it's a country that isn't unified, that doesn't work on a unified basis, and the differences outweigh the similarities over and over again. So when people talk about fascists, what they're talking about, what they have in their minds is not fascism as it was, which was an enterprise, which at the end of the day failed. What they have in mind is the war. They have in mind Hitler. It's Hitler they're thinking about, not Mussolini. They don't know who Mussolini was, or what he was, or how it worked, and so forth. And if you try to say to them, hey, you know, fascism is a war ideology. It comes out of war. When people say Trump is a fascist, or David Duke is a fascist, or whoever tossed the word around, they're not. They don't come out of war experience. They don't. They're not advocates of a kind of super patriotism. I mean, you don't hear that in political speeches in the United States. Fascism and doctrines of fascism have really nothing, if anything, to do with contemporary American politics. The notion that nation, above all, is what counts and what defines you and what should dictate policy and what should capture your attention. If that exists anywhere in the modern world, it exists in radical Muslim movements or states. When the Ayatollah Khomeini went to Iran in 1979 from Paris, and somebody asked him on the plane, aren't you excited to be going back to Iran? He spat. And he said, that's paganism. I don't give a damn about Iran. Iran is not what matters. I'm going back for Islam. And what I'm trying to do is to advance Islam. We don't have anything like that in this country today either. It's just not there. And yet the word fascism is tossed around all the time, as if it were something easy to define when it isn't. It was a post-World War I movement that went through infinite changes. What the right part of this kind of public rhetoric here today and in Europe and so forth, the right part of it has to do with a racist component. I'm going to talk about that right now. And the notion of the greater glory of a group. For Khomeini, it was Muslim. For some countries, it is states. The notion of race, very important. Okay. Nazism, as we all know, was defined by race. Hitler's mission was the triumph of the Aryan race and the oppression of lesser races, above all Slavs and Jews. And there's a huge literature on it, and it's all codified. And people study it in schools. The dissertation I was supposed to write, and never did. What's an Aryan? How do you define it? It's all done biologically. If you, the Nuremberg Code of which defines race, tells you what your purity of race is, what percentage Aryan are you, what percentage Aryan aren't you, how you're supposed to treat non-Aryans. Non-Aryans are to be enslaved by Aryans and so forth. The Italians, I mean, that's a very un-Italian way of thinking. And you can't have this kind of doctrine in a society like the Italian one in those years, which is in the process of being created. And a large part of what Mussolini was all about was to try to define what is an Italian, right? What is an American? An American is somebody who believes in the American rules, the Constitution, the Declaration, and all of that, and participates in American political life. In Italy in the 1920s and 1930s, there was no such set of rules. It was constantly being defined. One of my favorite documents in the history of fascism is an essay on fascism written by Nello Rosselli, one of the famous Rosselli brothers who led the anti-fascist resistance from Paris, went into exile, Jewish, socialist, so on, very brilliant, great writers and so on. So Rosselli writes this story about a group of foreign tourists being shown around Rome. And the guide takes them to all the usual places, the Colosseum, the Vatican, the Forum, etc. And at a certain point he says, any questions, anything you haven't seen that I can take you to? And so on. Someone says, yes, I'd like to see a corporation. Because we've read a whole lot that there was a doctrine of a corporate state that Mussolini and his economic advisors had generated. And the guide says, good question. Look, he said, we know there are corporations because the Duce has spoken about them and they exist in law. But in practice, nobody's ever actually seen one. And so there is no place that I can take you. I can't take you to some building and say, there's a corporation, that's what it looks like, and so forth, right? I mean, there's a lot of jokes about fascism and about Mussolini that are common in Italian society in those years. There are no Hitler jokes. It's interesting. I mean, there's no Hitler jokes, no Goebbels jokes, no Goering jokes, no Rosenberg jokes. They don't exist. Right here, of course, we have jokes about everybody, constantly. Sign of health, in my opinion. And so Italy is a work in creation. Hitler comes to Italy in the mid-1930s to be with his hero, Mussolini. And Hitler claims to have modeled the Third Reich on Italian fascism. Excuse me. It's hard to believe that that Hitler really believed that. But he did admire Mussolini, and he admired Mussolini because of one of the things that's common to both fascism and Nazism, and that is dictatorship. And when Mussolini comes out of the war and says, people who perform well in the war, the heroes of the war are the people who should govern the society, that is common with all fascist movements everywhere. And along with it goes a doctrine very important in 20th century history of the new fascist man. And this gets replicated across the board in all the mass movements, all the totalitarian mass movements. You have a new fascist man, a new Nazi man, a new communist man. Today we have a new Muslim man. Behaves differently, has superior qualities, is a greater hero, is braver, is tougher, and all of that. That is one of the things that fascism gave to the modern world, the notion that you can take a person who has been raised as a boring, bourgeois, monotonous, non-creative, non-brave family man and transform him into a hero warrior. And so Mussolini has all these phrases like better, how's it go, better 1 year as a hero than a lifetime as a sheep, and things like that. So talking about heroism, creativity, new kind of leadership, new kind of society, and so forth. Now, by the mid-1930s, by the time that Hitler becomes a major force in Europe, you have fascist movements in every single European country. Some places more important, some places less. Very important in England, for example, where you have Mosley leading a fascist movement that is significant and that matters. Germany we know about. In a way, the key part of Nazism, namely anti-Semitism and racism, that's a French invention. That emerges in France in the late 19th century, the Dreyfus Affair and so forth, and it's largely Catholic. And that is a certain point of similarity with the Italians, where anti-Semitism, insofar as it exists, and it exists, is a Catholic phenomenon, especially Jesuit. And it's interesting that today, in the Vatican, we are on our third consecutive pro-Jewish pope, 3 in a row, unheard of. John Paul II, Benedict, and now Francis, all like Jews. And indeed, there are connections between them and Jews which are very interesting and remain to be explored. But Francis' best friend is the chief rabbi of Buenos Aires. And when this guy and his Jewish colleagues come to Rome from Buenos Aires, which happens 2-3 times a year, they move into the Vatican. They live there in the same palace where Pope Francis lived, and they order kosher takeout from the ghetto. And Francis seems to like it, which is astonishing in itself. I suppose a tribute to the flexibility, the ideological flexibility of the Jesuits. But there was anti-Semitism in Italy, and it played a certain role in Italian fascism. But Italy being really a Catholic country, it's a problem. And it's a problem we don't think about because people don't study religion sufficiently nowadays. But the Nazi doctrine of racism is a violation of the sacrament of baptism. They're totally incompatible because the sacrament of baptism holds that anybody can become saved and a good Catholic by converting to Catholicism and being baptized. That makes you a Catholic. In Nazi racism, you can't convert from being Jewish or Slavic, and there is no ritual of baptism which will save you. If you're a Jew, you're a Jew. If you're a Slav, you're a Slav, and there's no way out of that. That's genetic. Well, the Italians never went for that, and indeed it's incompatible with Italian Catholicism. And various popes came out with various documents and doctrines explaining this, that it's sinful to be racist because it's a violation of one of the basic tenets and sacraments of Catholicism. I'm running out of time, and you haven't interrupted as you were supposed to. So I'm just going to say a couple of things briefly. The Nazi fascist thing has led me to the conclusion that there is no concept in political science that will embrace both Nazism and fascism. That at the end of the day, the differences between German Nazism and Italian fascism are much greater than their similarities, even though we fought a whole war against fascism. And that was a political confusion, an ideological mistake, and so forth. The concept that matters and that we should be using today is Hannah Arendt's, is totalitarianism. That's the thing that they have in common, and that they have in common with the communists, that they have in common with the Soviets. Totalitarianism now extends to our modern forms of anti-democratic, anti-Western doctrines, which is above all the radical Muslims. And just to close, the book I was fortunate enough to write recently with General Flynn, Field of Fight, goes into this notion in some detail that these are totalitarian enemies, and we are facing an alliance of both religious and non-religious totalitarian movements, which is what explains the fact that the enemy alliance that's trying to destroy us today consists of both radical Muslims, from whether it's Iran or whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever, and hand in hand with them, radical secular movements and states, from North Korea to Russia to Cuba and Venezuela, all over the world. And they share a contempt for and hatred of democracy. And they consider the people, if you read them, stripping out the things that make them either uniquely religious or uniquely non-religious, you find a contempt for us as people, as free people. Free people cannot be as strong and heroic as people ruled by strong leaders. They admire dictators. They think that dictators have proven themselves and that dictatorship works better than freedom and democracy. And we're going to have it out yet again. This is a war that goes on in different forms with different folks on different sides and so forth. I will just close by saying that Machiavelli was adamant that tyranny is the least stable form of government, and that the most stable, most durable, strongest, and most successful governments were mixed societies with mixed constitutions, and where people were free and spontaneous and creative. A part of that was there at the beginning of fascism, at the end of the war. By the time you get to the 1930s and the Nazis become dominant, it's gone. And so there you have it. And I hope I've convinced you that we don't have any of these today. There are no fascists running around. And it's a word that people have just used to say, I don't like him. He's a bad man. He's no good. But fascists, they aren't. And that applies, Jonah Goldberg is one of my very best friends, and a great writer and a brilliant person. So he wrote a book called Liberal Fascism. And it's a great book about certain kinds of liberals, but it doesn't have anything to do with fascism, because you won't find anywhere in there the central core of it, which is it's about war, and it comes out of war, and it's war experience that defines people both on our side and against us. So have at it. What's on your minds? What do you want to know? And here you thought Trump was a good fascist. Yes.
Yeah, you